why that happened, or so. It seems to be a never-ending thing. I'm probably going to be still making notes at my funeral.
Well, I mean, again, I've said it before when talking to, especially people who are looking into history and so forth. I mean, we can't expect to summarize the history of the world in a few books. I mean, we're talking about huge amount of material here, and then on top of that, everyone should agree, and that's even more difficult.
Oh yeah, it is strange, and what I've discovered is that so many subject areas are kind of linked together. You'll notice in my books that essentially that they begin with the story of the bloodline and with the Holy Grail mythology and that sort of thing, but they move off into areas of medicine and into scientific subjects and all sorts of things, and it's quite surprising how these subject areas are linked together, and yet our academic institutions separate them totally and build walls around them.
Yeah, yeah.
And it has been surprising for me, how one can achieve very high qualifications in a subject, but know very little, if not nothing, about the other things that tangent from it.
Yeah.
And somebody within those can get their qualifications and know very little about the other subjects. So what I tried to do was to begin to knock down the walls and the barriers, and there it was: religion, science, general history, medicine, mythology, all of these things linked together across these boundaries, and it gets very, very complicated. So, in a way, gathering the information and doing the research is one hard part of the task, but the rest of it is how to make it readable in a book.
Yeah.
Because you're dealing with all these separate areas, and, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not qualified in these areas. I'm simply, like a journalist, reporting on what was written and what was said and what still is being written and said. And I suppose that the biggest problem that people have these days, and I was as guilty of this as anybody, is that just about whatever one looks at from the past is that you try and judge it with the mind of today.
Yeah.
And it's an impossibility. You can't actually do that in the end because it doesn't work, and you've got to accept the fact that people in different time frames, within different cultures, had different viewpoints, and something that we might regard today as ridiculous, they didn't at that time. Something we might regard now as particularly violent and nasty, they didn't in those days, and you've got to try and get into the mindset of these people and to work out, why they were involved in certain things at certain times. And it's kind of weird, I kind of wish in a way that the publishing market itself worked very differently, because whenever I write a book, I find that lots of my readers start sending me information and links to other things, and that means that within about a year of writing the book, I could very easily update it. Not make too many corrections, but actually expand some of the things I'd begun to write about and make more of them and make them more understandable. But one isn't allowed to do that because the first book is still selling, and they don't like second editions very much anymore. What they want is a wholly new book about something else.
Really? Huh.
Just stuck. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. So I mean, if we were to, let's say, talk a little bit about the bloodline of Jesus, then, I mean, in a nutshell, is there any kind of conclusion you've come to in regards to this topic? Do you know for certain now that yes, it really was a bloodline that is still alive today, or is that all bunk? What's your opinion today about that?
Well, my opinion about it is that if one takes the majority of writers of the early era, let's say the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, and again it was a very big thing in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th century. It came to the fore again in a very large way. If one assumes that the majority of writers who are with a common opinion have kind of got it right, then yes, on the basis of that, as historical information, I'm thoroughly convinced of it. I mean, there's too much around that just agrees with each other, and it might come from Greece, or it might come from Sardinia, or it might come from North Africa, it might come from Rome, or whatever, but people totally divorced from each other were writing up the same story. So yes, I'm thoroughly convinced. I mean, I don't feel that it's proven, but I don't feel that anything we learn in history is proven. one can simply work on the basis that those people who were there at the time, just like journalists today, recorded this family and its doings as historical fact.
Right.
So one can only go along with that. What follows from that is that for a number of years and for a number of centuries, it was, just like a descent in any noble family, very important in terms of one's position in society and that sort of thing. So it got written about quite a lot. It was this word Despacini that flummoxed me to start with. Once I jumped that hurdle and realized what it meant. I mean, the word actually means heirs of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
That's the word Despacini. It's a Greek word.
Oh.
So that's where it comes from. But once one's hooked into that and looks for it and finds it in various places, you're into the family line. And yeah, so in Bloodline of the Holy Grail, I recorded everything that I could find about this family and went through, many generations. I mean, right from the first century, I can't remember now, but I think I took it, almost to modern times, but not quite. But to do that, I had to decide which line to follow each time, because it's quite extraordinary if you take anybody in the first century, and let's say they had 2 children, and each of those married, and each of those marriages had 2 children, and so it went on.
Mm.
What actually happens, and I think I wrote about this in Realm of the Ring Lords, which was my 3rd book, I worked out the mathematics on that, and forgetting the fact that some families don't have any children, and also that others have more than 2, some have 6 or 8 or whatever, but
Yeah.
forgetting all of that and just working on the 2-by-2 principle, the number of potential births in the year 2000 from a starting point of the first century came to a 26-digit figure.
Really?
Yeah, now if you
Sheesh.
think about it, there's 6-7 million people, a billion people in the world today.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a 10-digit figure. So what one achieves is an impossibility, or the fact that every one of us could be, and probably are in some way or another,
Related.
the way branches move out, descended from just about anybody in the first century.
Yeah.
So the question I normally get asked is, in terms of now or recent history, what's so important about this bloodline? Are there descendants around today? Well, yes, of course there are. Millions, probably. But what I tried to do was, wherever I could find the firstborn, I tried to follow the firstborn, and I had to do it with family registers and that sort of thing, and they very rarely got involved with females, so they always were interested in the male, the senior son of the line.
Really?
Because he was probably the prince of something or the king of something or whatever.
Hmm.
So it wasn't too difficult to sort of follow the senior son of the senior son of, that sort of thing. And it moved into many of the noble families of Europe and many reigning houses. So it was kind of intriguing. But in terms of importance, you can imagine that as every single generation passes, it dilutes.
Mm.
And so today there's no importance to it at all. I mean, we've all got a bit of it in us somewhere, and we've all got a bit of anybody else in the first century somewhere in us, and it makes little difference. And the conclusion I came to anyway, even following the bloodline, was that where there were those that were recorded in detail in history, be they kings or whatever there were the good ones and the bad ones, just like anything else. There were the honest ones and the crooked ones, just like any other family line. So in terms of importance, everybody that came from the line certainly wasn't a Jesus character, and certainly couldn't have been. That would never happen in any family. So my interest in it, and in fact my readership's main interest, is not based on that, and it's not based on today. It's really just based on a retelling of an aspect of history that not much has been taught about, if anything.
Yes.
And so it's a historical interest, really, and that's the way that I approached it, without really a need or a desire to prove anything at all. It didn't,
Right.
to me, it didn't affect my life, whether there was a family line that one could trace in any way, and knowing about it today is certainly not going to pay anybody's mortgage or make their life better. It's historical interest.
Have you noticed that there is, do you know if there are any royal houses around, the world, I guess we can say at this point, that are actually interested in this story? Have you worked for any of them to follow the lineage of them and see if they are actually more related or not to this,
Well, yeah, there are loads of royal houses around now that were dispossessed or, moved into exile or whatever throughout history. I mean, there aren't that many reigning European houses now. There's a handful, but not many of them. But in terms of the general picture that I got, I was kind of surprised once I decided to look at particular family lines. It was a surprise to me to discover that when I started to question some of these noble families about it, let's say the House of de Rohan in France, or the sort of houses that were very, very prominent until comparatively recent times, French Revolution, this sort of era, and around there, kind of took it on board as a matter of course and said, well, yes, of course, we know that. It wasn't a surprise to them. They were surprised by the fact that anybody would be interested, by the fact that they were descended from this line.
Okay.
And it was one of the ways that I found it not difficult to get hold of family archives and to sort of check through some of the descents to see, where these houses came from. And I mean, in the end, I didn't know where to go with it because there were so many families that claimed descent or whom I found the descent in. I didn't know which family to follow finally, and I thought, well, actually, since I'm a British author with a book coming out of Britain, I suppose I really ought to follow the British line, the line that was the last traceable reigning house in Britain.
Right.
And that turned out to be the Royal House of Stuart. They reigned in Scotland from 1371. They reigned in England also from 1603, and they finally moved out of office in 1688, and that was the end of it. But they actually, of all families, interesting, the longest reigning ever of all European royal houses. So that was, again, a surprise to me. It's not something that we're taught at school, but we had a reigning house here, which was the longest reigning. That was quite something. One gets fooled with a lot of countries, with the Louis in France and that sort of thing, because you think that's a long reigning house, and it isn't. I mean, it's a bit like the Pharaohs and whatever. They just kept taking these same names. So they weren't the same families, and they weren't necessarily descended. May have been for a few generations, but not long. But the Royal House of Stuart was interesting, and so that kind of was where my book finished. And I thought, well, I'll just trace the family line down to today and see who's around, today as head of that house. And I did that trace, and that was where the book finished.
Now, do you want?
I really was from the 1st century right down to date.
Yes, okay, I got you. And of course, do you want to talk a little bit about Prince Michael of Albany? I don't know the full title of him, but there is a continuation then of the Royal House of Stuart, in your opinion, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, not in my opinion, but in terms of family archive and national archives in France and Belgium and whatever.
Right.
I mean, all of these royal houses. I mean, the House of Bourbon, and it doesn't really matter where you go. There weren't many royal houses in Europe that finished because the family line deceased with no heir. They were deposed, or the church got in the way, they were exiled, or whatever happened. Well, that still left somebody and the lines continued. And very many of these families, I mean, even the House of Napoleon still exists, it's still there. And the descendants are still there. And remarkably, what I discovered was it was surprising, because behind the scenes, a lot of these families were really doing quite a lot of work, as if they were still reigning princes.
Really?
They were, acting as constitutional advisors, all sorts of things behind the scenes. And so, in terms of Prince Michael, who's the current head of the House of Stuart and has been since 1958, and he was very young in 1958. He was hardly born, but the fact was, he was a minority head and became active by the 1970s. But the fact was that I had him as the last descendant I could discover